But Madam Chair, trade is about reciprocity. And that means you get something in exchange for giving something. And the fundamental question we should be asking the government, after they've had multiple years to consider whether they would agree to allow the UK to join CPTPP, is what has Canada received in exchange for allowing this to occur? Our pork and cattle producers have had incredible difficulty accessing the UK's market, while at the same time, exports, for example, beef exports from the UK into Canada have doubled in just 1 year, about $48 million in 2024. We have now allowed the UK to join the CPTPP while leaving these non-tariff barrier disputes or trade irritants with the UK to persist. Why would this government allow this moment to pass without negotiating a win for Canadians? Sound familiar? As well, I was very pleased to see my honourable colleague, bless you, I was very pleased to see my honourable colleague from the NDP raise the UK pensioner issue. There are well over 100,000 UK citizens living in Canada, maybe even as high as 140,000, who do not have a cost of living increase on their UK pension. Now you might say, well, what's so wrong with that? Well, I'll tell you what's wrong with that, Madam Chair. It's inequity. It's unfairness, because that same retiree, had they lived in or chosen to retire in a different country like the United States, they get a cost of living increase on their pension. Why is the government not making this a priority to solve on behalf of this very large group of individuals, just as a matter of fairness? We are told that the Prime Minister is a master negotiator. We're told that the Prime Minister has worldly relationships, a global network of which he was going to bring to bear to solve Canada's problems. And yet, we stand here today and the government has nothing to show for agreeing to allow the UK to join the CPTPP. It could have solved the pensioner issue had they asked. It's unclear whether they've even brought this up with the UK. In fact, in many questions to the former Minister of Foreign Affairs and the Minister of International Trade, the answer was, it's not a priority at this time. Well, have fun trying to tell that to the UK pensioners who believe that, as a matter of fairness, that they deserve a cost of living increase. And they would be correct, Madam Chair. It's difficult to take that same position with our cattle and pork producers, who have worked very hard to expand their markets in the world, only to be met with unfair trade practices, non-tariff barriers to trade, by specifically the UK, that prevent our producers' products from reaching the UK shelves, while at the same time, the UK products are free to come in to Canada. Why would we allow this moment to pass without negotiating a resolution to those problems, or at least demonstrating that the government is aware of these issues and has a path to resolve them? They have been absolutely silent on resolving these problems. It is reasonable to assume that they haven't even attempted to resolve them, because they don't talk about them. They don't acknowledge they even really exist. They barely want to, recognize that they have not they barely want to recognize that these issues exist, because then it's an admission that they've had multiple years to fix them and they haven't been able to deliver. These unfair trade practices, especially with respect to cattle and pork producers, they're not rooted in science. I bet you the first thing that a UK citizen or maybe even a UK diplomat does when they go to visit the wonderful Calgary Stampede, I bet you they visit a steakhouse right away. I'm sure they have no problem consuming our wonderful steaks in Alberta, in Canada, but they want to work to keep that product out and off the shelves in the UK. So this is a government that's unwilling to do the hard work. They walked away from bilateral trade negotiations. Why? Because they probably believed that the UK was going to join CPTPP anyway. And so they thought, well, why bother with a bilateral trade agreement? We have a trade continuity agreement, which they let expire, by the way, to the detriment of many businesses, including, for example, small artisan cheese shops, many of which have struggled significantly. Some have even closed, including, unfortunately, one in Simcoe North, which was a wonderful operation. But because of this government's lack of ability to negotiate with the UK, they had to close. So what is it really that the government has achieved with allowing the UK to join the CPTPP? What is it? What did we get for it? These are questions that the public want to know. These are questions that cattle and pork producers want to know. These are questions the opposition wants to know. You're in a negotiation. You give something, you get something. These are questions that the UK pensioners deserve to know. This is a country with whom we have a wonderful shared history. Why is it that a UK pensioner living in Canada is treated differently than a UK pensioner living in the United States? It just doesn't seem fair, Madam Chair. I don't think anybody would think that's fair on its face. So if you break it down, we have a request from an ally to allow them to join a very large trade agreement, which on its face seems completely reasonable. Canada believes in free trade. We're a free trading nation. But we should also believe in fair trade, and we should believe in reciprocity. But out of curiosity, I went to look at what the top 10 Canadian exports to the UK were. Do you know what they are, Madam Chair? I'll give you a hint. The first one, sometimes you like to wear it, and you look good in gold, Madam Chair. Gold is the #1 export to the UK, which leads me to another question. Where is all the gold in Canada? Where are the reserves? Canada has no more gold reserves at the Bank of Canada. Guess who sold some of those reserves, Madam Chair? The Prime Minister, when he was central bank governor. Guess who he sold them to? The UK. Interesting. Out of the top 52 countries that have gold reserves in the world, guess where Canada ranks? Not even on the list, Madam Chair, because we have 0. While other countries around the world have been piling up their gold reserves, Canada has been selling them all. The US, China, Poland, Turkey, the list goes on and on and on. And Canada has made the choice to sell its gold reserves. Thank you to the Prime Minister. Now, to the Prime Minister's defense, he's not the only central bank governor that's been selling Canada's gold. That's been going on for many years, but he continued it. But it's funny that he sold it to the country of which he then went to become that central bank governor. I guess he was okay to keep it when he was the central bank governor in the UK. They didn't sell their gold reserves, Madam Chair. So if we think about this entire agreement, it might seem benign on its face, but we're left with some questions. What did Canada get? Why are our cattle and pork producers still left outside in the cold? Why are the UK pensioners still have their pensions unfairly lowered by this government's inaction to negotiate anything? I mean, can the government even point to any wins it has achieved on any negotiating front, period, other than signing an agreement? I mean, even look at the Canada-US discussion. Canada has made a litany of concessions, although the Minister of Canada-US Relations says, oh, I wouldn't call those concessions. Actually, I've never heard anyone describe them as anything other than concessions. We gave in on the DST. We withdrew complaints about softwood lumber. We have made significant other concessions to the US in exchange for waiting for an answer. Basically zero. No agreement, not really even a path to agreement apparently. They're not even talking anymore. This Prime Minister's also said, well, you know, we might be close on a deal on aluminum and steel. Well, that's nice. What about autos? What about lumber? What about the folks in the canola sector who are kind of caught between Canada and the US? It doesn't appear that this government's moving with a sense of urgency. And now, I appreciate the intervention of my colleague just prior, Madam Chair, and the Prime Minister has said a very similar thing, which is the government wants to, the government's goal, you know, we want to increase Canada's non-US exports by 50% over a decade. Well, golly gee, is that really the moonshot we think it is? What are we supposed to do for the next 10 years? How are we going to survive as a country if we have to wait 10 years before we can diversify 50%, increase our trade by non-US exports by 50%? What is going to happen to our industries between now and over the next decade while we wait? How much is that going to cost the Canadian taxpayer? How much is that going to cost the auto worker and their families in Ontario, or the farmers out west, or the people who work in the lumber mills and the paper mills and in that sector? What are we telling them? We need to act now. But this government doesn't really act with any sense of urgency. If you just look at GDP per capita, Canada is on a per person basis poorer today than we were in 2019. This government doesn't seem to care about that. But everyone else recognizes that GDP per capita is a measure of living standards. We are going in the wrong direction. It's nice that we're here debating free trade, and as I mentioned, of course, Canada's Conservatives support free trade, but we support fair trade. We support getting good deals for Canadians. And here, we've given something and have gotten nothing in return. You might be thinking, why are we even debating this bill today? Is it because the government has not made a deal with our largest trading partner in the United States? Is it because they would enjoy not talking about the failure to get a deal with our largest trading partner and closest ally? They've had multiple years to sit on this piece of legislation, to consider moving it forward. Why are we moving it now? What did we get? What's coming next? We're left with all of these questions, Madam Chair, and we're left wondering, what is it that Canada and Canadians and our producers received in exchange for allowing the UK into this deal while the UK is still punishing unfairly our cattle producers, our pork producers, and UK pensioners? You would think that the Prime Minister, very close personal friends with Prime Minister Starmer, that he would have been able to deliver some pretty big wins for Canadian industry, and even for the UK pensioners living in Canada. You would have thought that maybe he would have said, you know, do me a solid. Can you give me something for allowing you to join this agreement? It's not even clear whether there was any even negotiations about this. So the government hasn't even disclosed that it's on the radar. It's been brought up in this House multiple times. Next week, the UK pensioners are going to be in Ottawa, and I invite members of all parties, but including the government, to go and speak to them and look them in the eyes and say, you know, we just negotiated a trade deal or a agreement with the UK to join a big trade deal, the CPTPP. Look them in the eyes and say, we gave the UK something. And what are these pensioners going to say back? Maybe they'd say, well, what about us? Did you get anything for us? Go to the cattle producers and say, good news, we just expanding, we're going to expand the markets. And the cattle producers will say, well, we still can't get into the UK. Doesn't help us. What did we get for it? These are completely reasonable questions that the government needs to answer, that reasonable Canadians would have, that reasonable producers in cattle and pork and other agricultural products would have. You know, why are we agreeing to something without getting anything in return? So I come back to reciprocity, Madam Chair. We need to get the United Kingdom back to the negotiating table on a bilateral agreement. I worry that the government thinks its job is done now because the UK is going to join CPTPP. But these trade irritants still exist, and the government has not indicated that there is a path to even talking about them, let alone resolving them. There are not negotiations happening bilaterally with the UK currently, Madam Chair. And so while I appreciate the government trying to advance Canada's interests around the world, we have to ask ourselves, what are we getting when we give things up to other countries? That has to be a fundamental question that this government should answer for, especially when we have very glaring groups of not just people, but producers and industry who have concerns with the United Kingdom and how they do their trade practices, and in the case of the UK pensioners, just asking to be treated fairly. So Canada's Conservatives, Madam Chair, in summary, Canada's Conservatives support free trade. Of course we do, but we support fair trade and we support negotiating wins for Canadians at every single opportunity. And Madam Chair, this looks like a missed opportunity for Canadians from this government. Thank you.